The idea of creating a universal aircraft capable of performing many different tasks appeared as early as the First World War. But after its end, this idea became especially important for the aviation of many small countries. Some of these countries had just appeared on the political map of Europe and did not have enough money to purchase many specialized aircraft for different purposes. The end of the First World War was bitter for Germany. It was no easier for military equipment designers, among whom the Dutchman Anthony Fokker held a leading position. His famous fighters terrified many Allied pilots, but these were by far not the only types of aircraft produced at his factories. The company also manufactured reconnaissance aircraft and training machines, and all this greatness was about to come to an end. Already at the end of 1918, numerous members of the Allied Control Commission roamed devastated Germany like rats, uncovering everything they believed could contribute to the revival of German power. For some time, Fokker managed to evade inspections, but in 1919 the situation became unbearable. In just 1.5 months, he spirited away to his native Netherlands more than 200 aircraft right under the noses of the Allies. 120 D-7 fighters, 20 D-8 aircraft, 60 reconnaissance planes, and many experimental machines. He also transported more than 400 engines, 100 parachutes, and significant stockpiles of aviation materials. The starting capital was substantial, and already in August 1919, the Netherlands Aircraft Factory was registered in Amsterdam. Later, the name included the owner's surname. Soon, the aircraft plant was ready, with its personnel at first only assembling aircraft from transported parts. The first of these were the D-7 fighter and a reconnaissance plane. To preserve continuity, Fokker retained the German designation system, C and D types, for his machines. Their further development continued in parallel, with new solutions being introduced simultaneously. It would be wrong to call this product a novelty, since the aircraft had been designed during the war, but it did not make it to the front. In the design of the first version, proven structural solutions from Fokker's fighters were used, first applied on a 2-seat machine. Further models followed this first one. The first and last of them were widely used by the Soviet Air Force in the 1920s. Overall, export activity was a defining characteristic of Fokker's enterprise. Little Holland, with its tiny armed forces, could not satisfy the ambitious plans of the famous Anthony Fokker. Moreover, another Flying Dutchman had returned to his homeland, Frederick Koolhoven, who, like Fokker, had built combat aircraft during the First World War, but only for England. Foreign deliveries left their mark on the company's design work. It was extraordinarily flexible, adapting to satisfy the demands of the most diverse customers. The most successful aircraft of the company in this respect was the C.V, a 2-seat multipurpose aircraft with the typical scheme of a classic single-engine biplane of the 1920s. It fully repeated the layout of an earlier variant. The diversity of possible roles, short-range reconnaissance, long-range reconnaissance, light bomber, 2-seat fighter, was ensured by several interchangeable sets of wings with different spans and numerous armament configurations. Considering the requirements of export orders, the designers provided an entire range of different engines, both air-cooled and liquid-cooled, with power from 250 to 500 horsepower. The design of the C.V, created under the leadership of Reinhold Platz, was simple and inexpensive, not requiring complex tools or equipment from the manufacturer. The fuselage was based on a welded frame of steel tubes. Its rigidity was increased at the front with tubular struts, and at the rear with piano wire bracing. Stringers were mounted on the frame, over which fabric covering was stretched. The wing, with constant cord across the entire span, was entirely wooden. Spars and ribs were made of pine. The covering was partly plywood and partly fabric. The upper wing was raised above the fuselage with struts made of steel tubes, while the lower parts were attached directly to the fuselage spars. Interplane struts had the traditional form. Ailerons were mounted only on the upper wing. In Fokker's tradition, they extended beyond the wingtips and had a wooden frame with plywood skin. The distinctive feature of the future universal aircraft was 3 interchangeable types of upper wing. A team of mechanics could replace any of them within 1 hour. They were designated with the letters A, B, and C. The first was intended for short-range reconnaissance or a heavy fighter with a span of 39 feet 5 inches. The second was for long-range reconnaissance, span 43 feet 9 inches. And finally, the last was for a light bomber, 47 feet 11 inches. The vertical and horizontal tail surfaces on all three types had identical construction, steel tubes and fabric covering. The control surfaces had horn aerodynamic compensation. To provide customers with a wide choice of power plants, the entire front section of the fuselage was made as a removable unit. Engines of different types were mounted on the same 4 bolts. The engine cowlings, of course, corresponded to each specific engine. They were duralumin and quick release. If a liquid-cooled engine was used, a radiator was mounted under the engine. The landing gear with a solid axle was made of steel tubes with a teardrop cross-section, hinged together and reinforced with bracing. Shock absorption was provided by rubber buffers. At the rear stood a steerable skid. Both crew members sat in separate cockpits, one behind the other, and if necessary, the aircraft could be fitted with dual controls, turning it into a trainer. The first aircraft built in the CV series had a Type A wing and was therefore called the CVA. It was equipped with an American Liberty engine with a power of 420 horsepower, which allowed the aircraft to reach 145 miles per hour. It could climb to an altitude of up to 19,000 feet. The second machine, the CVB model, was initially fitted with a 250 horsepower German BMW engine, which was later replaced with a French engine rated at 400 horsepower. A little later, this version of the 5 was tested with a French Hispano-Suiza engine of 450 horsepower. In that same year, 1924, a third experimental prototype, the CVC, appeared with the same Hispano engine. Later, it was also tested with another power plant, the British Napier Lion, also producing 450 horsepower. The increased weight of the last two versions reduced their maximum speed to 135 and 130 miles per hour, respectively. Customers were offered a choice of different armament options. The heaviest armament belonged to the fighter variant, which carried 2 synchronized machine guns above the engine and 2 mounted on the turret near the observer. All other options included 1 forward-firing machine gun and 1 or 2 in the rear cockpit, plus bomb racks under the central section of the wing. The aircraft performed well during tests. It was stable, sufficiently maneuverable, and obedient to the pilot. The next step in the development of the CV was the reconnaissance aircraft CV. It differed from its predecessors by new trapezoidal wings with ailerons integrated into the wing outline, similar to those of the DXI and D3 fighters, and by an additional fuel tank installed in the central section of the upper wing. In 1925, the CV family was expanded with 2 new modifications which later replaced all the earlier versions. Their main difference lay in the wing design. While types A, B, and C were practically clean biplanes in which the span of the upper and lower wings was nearly the same, the new D and E became sesquiplanes, with the lower wing much shorter than the upper one. In addition, the wings themselves were built following the example of the CVs, though without additional fuel tanks. The D modification, with a shorter upper wing spanning 41 feet, was intended for use as a 2-seat fighter, artillery spotter, or short-range reconnaissance plane. In the first case, the aircraft carried 4 machine guns, in the second, 2 machine guns and a radio station. In the third, 3 machine guns, 1 in front and 2 in the rear. The E variant was designed as a long-range reconnaissance plane and a day bomber. Its upper wing had a span of 50 feet. The last 2 variants also differed in the design of the interplane struts. In the CVD, they were V-shaped, while in the CVE, they were N-shaped. However, this principle was sometimes violated, as part of the CV batch was fitted with N-shaped struts. Thus, the D and E modifications covered the entire range of combat roles that had previously required 3 types. What the experimental CVD was like is unknown. Perhaps it never existed at all. The first CV, however, was converted from a CVC fitted with a British Jupiter engine producing 420 horsepower. Such vigorous activity could not go unnoticed, and potential buyers increasingly visited Amsterdam, where the new aircraft made a very favorable impression. The first order for 19 C-VIX aircraft was received from the Dutch Armed Forces as early as December 1924, and by April 1925 the CVE had completed its trials. By the end of that year, the entire batch had been delivered. These machines were powered by Hispano-Suiza engines rated at 350 horsepower. In 1926, 7 more CVE were built and 6 more in 1927. The last 2 were equipped with British Armstrong Jaguar engines producing 360 horsepower. The spare parts package included 2 fuselages. Later, wings were purchased for them, and between 1926 and 1929, 2 additional reconnaissance aircraft were assembled from spare parts. A fine advertisement for both the aircraft and the company was the victory in the international aviation competitions held in Zurich in 1927. At this demonstration of air power, the Netherlands fielded a team consisting of Captain Stoop, Lieutenants Santberg and Schott, as well as Sergeants Bakkenis and Mutseyers, flying aircraft from the First Order. In the flight across the Alps for the Escher Cup on August 17, 21 crews took part, 2 of which made forced landings shortly after takeoff, while another 11 turned back due to bad weather. Lieutenant Schott was the first to reach the destination, only to learn that the race had been canceled because of unsuitable weather. Naturally, no protest helped. A new start was announced on August 20th, and Schott was again among the participants. But this time he took off only after several telephone calls about the weather conditions. This time, no one could take away his well-earned victory. At the same event, the Dutch Air Force team also took first place in formation flying. At the end of 1925, Denmark shook its purse, and the Amsterdam plant produced 5 CVB aircraft for them, equipped with 400 horsepower engines. The machines were officially accepted in 1926. Already in March to June 1926, the Danes decided to test the novelty in their own way, organizing a long-distance flight to the Far East with 2 aircraft. Although the second aircraft was damaged in Thailand, it was repaired and later returned to Denmark on its own. The crew of the first aircraft, consisting of Captain Botved, pilot, and flight engineer Opsen, successfully flew from Copenhagen to Tokyo via India. On their return, the aviators decided to travel through Siberia, covering 6,460 miles in 72 flight hours, which corresponded to an average route speed of 90 miles per hour. The results of this experiment were considered successful, and between 1927 and 1931, military aviation workshops assembled 13 more such machines from kits purchased from Fokker. Another Pathfinder was purchased in 1926 for evaluation by the Japanese Army. Later, it was transferred to the Asahi Shimbun newspaper concern, where it was used as a service and mail aircraft. That same year, the Dutch Air Force received the first 6 of 16 ordered aircraft in the fighter variant. The remaining 10 were delivered in 1927. In 1929, another 5 were acquired, but by that time they had so many differences from the base model that they received a new designation. Finally, in 1932, the company delivered 5 aircraft to the Dutch Air Force with engines rated at 500 horsepower and pneumatic low-pressure tires. While the Dutch Air Force was tempted by 2 reconnaissance variants, the Navy, tasked with defending and servicing the vast colonial possessions, decided that float-equipped bombers would suit it perfectly. The planned purchase volume varied from 50 to 80 aircraft depending on the source. For that time, this was already a considerable number, but the sailors, being practical people by nature, decided to first verify the quality before paying for the entire batch. Unfortunately, the 6 float planes built in 1925 performed very poorly in service, being prone to capsizing on landing with even the slightest waves. After several accidents, they were converted to wheel undercarriage. An experimental seaplane with internal shock absorbers installed in the float struts also failed and was never built in series. Nevertheless, the aircraft was so good that in 1927 the Navy still gave in, or perhaps decided to support the domestic manufacturer, and ordered 18 land planes. The colonies also contributed to strengthening the aviation industry of the mother country. The Dutch East Indies, today's Indonesia, which had its own armed forces, purchased 20 aircraft with Napier Lion engines, operated under a special designation. Later in 1928-1929, another 4 were bought, fitted with American Curtiss Conqueror engines. They remained in service on the islands practically until the end of the 1930s. Simultaneously with the East Indies order, in 1927, Bolivia requested a batch of light bombers with Hispano-Suiza engines rated at 600 horsepower. Following the passionate Bolivians, the calm and level-headed Scandinavians also invested. In 1928, Norway acquired 5 aircraft with Jupiter engines rated at 450 horsepower for its army. And from June 1929, production was started under license at the Keller Aircraft Factory, where 23 examples were built, including one with a German engine. In 1934, this same plant began producing an improved model with Panther II engines rated at 575 horsepower, developed by the British Armstrong Vickers Company, and the aircraft already in service started to be re-equipped with 730 horsepower Bristol Pegasus radials. Assembly progressed extremely slowly and continued until early 1939. In total, only 17 aircraft were produced in 5 years, but they became the last biplanes of this family manufactured anywhere in the world. Sweden bought in 1927 2 pairs of aircraft from different modifications as evaluation samples. The first pair was given a special code and reclassified as 2-seat fighters. A year later, 4 of one model and 6 of another modification were purchased. All of them were equipped with Bristol Jupiter 6 engines. On one of these aircraft, Lieutenant Lundborg evacuated Umberto Nobile from the camp of the survivors of the crashed airship Italia. During the second landing, one ski dug into the snow and the aircraft flipped over. In January 1928, Sweden purchased the license for both modifications, and from 1929 they began to be produced at the Malmslätt workshops. By 1932, 24 aircraft with Jupiter engines had been assembled there. In 1933, 1 aircraft of one modification and 10 of another with Mercury engines rated at 600 horsepower, produced in Sweden by the Nohab firm, were built. Thus, the Swedish Air Force received 49 aircraft of this family, including several float-equipped examples that received a special designation. Their design turned out to be far more successful than that of the Dutch float variants. The floats were larger and stronger, the struts reinforced, and additional braces were added from the floats to the lower wing. The rudder was also enlarged. From 1927, the Hungarian government bought, in total, 7 aircraft of one modification and 8 of another. However, like Germany, Hungary was bound by the Versailles Treaties, which prohibited the creation of military aviation. Nevertheless, it existed secretly. The Fokkers were operated as light bombers, reconnaissance and training aircraft. Officially, they were registered as postal or meteorological planes. This did not prevent them from carrying 2 machine guns and bomb racks for 440 pounds of bombs, which were removed before public demonstrations or photography. At the end of 1927, Hungary purchased a license to produce 50 aircraft, and almost a year later, in December 1928, the Manfred Weiss Company plant in Budapest rolled out the first one. The Hungarian-built Fokkers differed from the prototype by the shape of their struts. Later final assembly was moved to the workshops at Ferihegy Airfield. The last 9 machines had different landing gear construction. All these aircraft were powered by French-built copies of the Jupiter engine rated at 420 horsepower. Starting in 1933, Hungary launched production of improved Fokker variants designed by Varga. The first, named Budapest 9, was a reconnaissance plane, and the second, Budapest 14, a bomber. Interestingly, their main difference, reflected in the names, lay in the number of engine cylinders and accordingly their power. The Pathfinder carried a 9-cylinder Mistral rated at 590 horsepower, while the bomber was equipped with a 14-cylinder Mistral Major rated at 860 horsepower. Respectively, 8 and 4 were produced. In 1927, Switzerland purchased 3 aircraft with Jupiter engines, and 4 years later another 3 machines with improved characteristics. In 1932, 2 factories, one in Thun and the other in Alten Rhein, received an order for 50 aircraft equipped with powerful Spanish engines rated at 600 horsepower. In 1933, 41 aircraft were produced, and in 1934, another 8. Some sources state that 45 machines were built by a subsidiary of the Dornier Company. These aircraft had an improved cooling radiator and a new landing gear. 1 aircraft with an American Liberty engine was purchased for study by the Soviet Air Force. In November 1926, this machine was tested at the research airfield. The report did not specify the exact modification of the aircraft, which was not surprising. Only 1 fuselage was purchased, but with 2 sets of wings of different types. The aircraft was tested with both wing variants under different loads, as a reconnaissance plane and as a light bomber. The tests were successful. This aircraft proved to be faster and climb better than the domestic aircraft, although it was slightly inferior in maneuverability during horizontal flight. The takeoff and landing qualities of the Dutchman were also better. The report's conclusion noted, "Recognize this aircraft as one that deserves great attention." The successful cable design and the machine's strength were praised, while the shortcomings included the inconvenient draining of water and oil in winter due to small valves, as well as an unsatisfactory landing gear. Soviet specialists considered the landing gear of the previous model better designed. There were also complaints about the power plant. The engine overheated because of the small size of the radiator. It was suggested to test the aircraft with a more powerful French engine. The machine was left at the research airfield for developing tactics of using two-seat fighters and for equipment testing. It remained in service there at least until the summer of 1933. In the late 1920s, this aircraft took part in comparative trials with various Soviet machines. In December 1927, engineer Stoneman proposed a project to convert the aircraft to a German engine, but it was never implemented. In 1931, the northeastern Chinese warlord Zheng Shuiliang, son of the famous general defeated by the Red Army in 1928, concluded an agreement to supply him with 20 fighters and 30 aircraft of this type. In August of the same year, one fighter began testing in Mukden. However, the work in China did not go smoothly from the very beginning. The main issue was the absence of a translator who knew both Chinese and Dutch. As a result, communication went through a Russian émigré who translated into English or German. Because of this, information often became heavily distorted, which threatened dangerous consequences. For example, during a demonstration firing at ground targets, several people, including a company representative, almost lost their lives. Naturally, after such a scandal, the contract was terminated, and the aircraft that arrived on October 15th was not even allowed to fly. The next step in the evolution was an improved version with a new landing gear design and a powerful British Bristol Pegasus engine of 730 horsepower, enclosed in a streamlined cowling ring. Such aircraft were built for Denmark and Finland. Unlike the Finns, the Danes intended to acquire a sample for licensed production. It was delivered to Copenhagen in July 1933. Based on this prototype, 30 aircraft were built in two variants. The first differed from the prototype in the tail design, while the second also had an elongated engine cowling. The Finns purchased their first aircraft with a Jupiter engine of 420 horsepower in 1927, but due to financial reasons, the acquisition of a batch of these favored aircraft was postponed until 1935. At that time, 13 machines with Bristol Pegasus engines of 620 horsepower entered Finnish aviation service. Unlike the Danish aircraft, they retained the original hook-shaped rudder. By 1936, production had ceased everywhere except Norway, where only a few units were built each year. The last variant produced in significant numbers was the Dutch project for upgrading the entire fleet of these machines in the National Air Force. In 1933, it was proposed to equip the aircraft with British Rolls-Royce Kestrel engines of 580 horsepower. In 1934-1935, the reworking of old machines began, except for those with specific engines. The work was carried out at the Fokker factory in Amsterdam and at Army workshops. Fokker modernized 10 aircraft this way, while the Army workshops reworked 40 machines. The upgraded aircraft received a new designation. In addition to the engine installation, they were fitted with new landing gear with forward-placed wheels equipped with brakes. On some aircraft, the upper fuel tank was moved into the fuselage. 5 aircraft were fitted with dual controls and became trainers. Beyond this, Fokker and the Army workshops assembled 7 new aircraft from spare parts. Following the upgraded pattern, but without replacing the engines, another 5 aircraft were modified. In total, the Dutch Air Force received 71 improved machines. Modernization of earlier purchased aircraft was also carried out in Denmark. 5 machines were converted, remaining in service until 1935. These aircraft were brought to the standard of the late models. The appearance of this aircraft spurred the creation of some designs that were, in fact, products of its further modernization. Among them was undoubtedly the Hungarian aircraft, which differed from the original by its elongated cowling, new landing gear, and side cockpit windows. In Switzerland, in 1936, a company released a model with a more streamlined cowling, a new vertical tail, a tunnel radiator, a variable pitch propeller with a spinner on the hub, fairings on the main landing gear wheels, and a tail wheel instead of a skid. The Hungarian project of a 3-seat Hurricane moved the farthest away from the original aircraft. From the Fokker, only the wings and tail remained. The fuselage was made oval and much larger, which made it possible to comfortably place 3 crew members in an enclosed cockpit with good visibility. teardrop-shaped fairings were planned for the landing gear wheels. However, as a result of all these improvements, the aircraft became significantly heavier, which sharply worsened its flight performance. In addition, the cockpit visibility deteriorated, and there could be no talk of mass production. Nevertheless, this interesting biplane was used for various research purposes for several years. With that, the story of the aircraft came to a complete end. By that time, more than 1,000 examples of this aircraft and its variants had been built worldwide, about 600 of them in the Netherlands. Naturally, with such numbers, the Fokkers were simply doomed to take part in combat operations, which, amid growing international tensions, soon began in different corners of the globe. The participation in colonial operations in Libya has already been mentioned earlier, but the first real war in which these aircraft took part was the conflict between Bolivia and Paraguay. In September 1938, in Munich, a shameful treaty was signed on the division of Czechoslovakia between Germany, Hungary, and Poland. Even during the negotiations at the beginning of the month, Hungarian army forces began concentrating on the Czech border. By this time, most Hungarian Fokkers had already been removed from combat units, with only a few machines of this type remaining in the 1st and 7th Reconnaissance Squadrons alongside German aircraft. From the end of September, Hungarian aircraft frequently violated the border, not only conducting reconnaissance, but also strafing Czechoslovak army units and fortifications. Naturally, all this provoked corresponding countermeasures from Czechoslovakia. At the beginning of November, the country was dismembered, but the border remained restless, and in March 1939, a real war broke out between Hungary and the newly formed Slovakia. However, by this time, all Fokkers had already been withdrawn from the combat strength of the Hungarian Air Force. Then it was the turn of Finnish aircraft to demonstrate their combat qualities. By the end of November 1939, when the famous Winter War began, 6 Fokkers were in service with the Finnish Air Force, which together with 4 other aircraft formed the 14th Squadron based at Liko. From the first days of the war, the squadron's 3rd flight, which had 5 aircraft, began flying reconnaissance and bombing missions against advanced Soviet units. On December 15th, the flight was transferred to Konnunsuo, where, together with the 2nd flight detached from the 12th Squadron, 4 aircraft, it formed the so-called Salo Detachment, placed under the operational command of the headquarters of the 1st Air Regiment. However, already on the 21st, the detachment was sent to Raiseli, where on the 25th it was reinforced with 3 Swedish aircraft of the same type. Nevertheless, the detachment, whose increased strength more resembled a squadron, did not remain in this composition for long, and after the New Year holidays, on January 3rd, an order came to transfer the newcomers to the 16th Squadron. The remaining 5 were also sent there on February 12th. In the new unit, the aircraft were distributed as follows. The 3 Swedes joined the 1st flight, and the 5 Dutch, the 3rd. By that time, the situation on the front was becoming increasingly tense. The new Soviet offensive, launched on February 1st, led to the breakthrough of the Mannerheim Line. The squadron, transferred on the 16th to Suistamo, desperately tried, like the rest of the Finnish air units, to hinder the enemy's advance. Despite the absolute dominance of Soviet fighters in the air, none of the 5 was shot down by Soviet pilots. And since the bombing strikes of the Finnish biplanes were aimed mainly at the front line, they also suffered little from heavy anti-aircraft artillery fire. However, they often had to break through fire from quadruple machine guns and rifles. Although Soviet infantry could not boast of downing a single Fokker of this type, combat damage could not be avoided, and by February 25th, 2 Swedes in the 1st flight were written off as beyond repair. The Dutch fought more successfully and survived the war without losses. Altogether, during the Winter War, Finnish aircraft carried out more than 200 combat sorties, and after its end, they were transferred to training units, where their modest ranks were supplemented by 2 interned Norwegian aircraft. The importance of the strategic position of Denmark and Norway had sooner or later to draw both countries into the orbit of the Second World War, and in the spring of 1940, the second stage of the German Blitzkrieg fell upon them. By that time, the Danish Air Force had only 16 Fokkers in service. In addition, several dozen aircraft were listed as trainers, and another 2 dozen were in disassembled condition in depots. Early in the morning of April 9th, a group of German bombers escorted by twin-engine fighters appeared over Copenhagen. When they flew over Verlos Air Base, a single Danish fighter took off and was immediately shot down. Then the Germans stormed the parking areas and anti-aircraft positions at the edges of the airfield, leaving behind the burning wrecks of 14 Fokkers, 10 reconnaissance aircraft from both reconnaissance squadrons, and 4 fighters. On their way out of the attack, a pair of German twin-engine fighters encountered a lone aircraft returning from a training flight and sent it down in a single pass. With that, in essence, combat operations for the Danish Air Force ended. The government signed the capitulation, and at the demand of the Germans, the entire aircraft fleet was mothballed. In Norway, the situation was different. At the time of the German invasion, the small Norwegian Air Force had only 40 fighters, and therefore could not offer serious resistance to the Germans. However, the mountainous terrain, severe weather conditions, the almost complete lack of roads, and as a result, the impossibility of using motorized troops, played in favor of the defenders. Although during the fighting on April 9th, the Germans lost 2 cruisers, Blücher and Karlsruhe, and the following day another one, Königsberg. The advantage was entirely on their side. Around 10,000 soldiers, the first echelon of 3 divisions, were landed in Oslo, Kristiansand, Stavanger, Bergen, Trondheim, and Narvik. All airfields in the southern part of the country were also captured. However, the German Luftwaffe failed to destroy the Norwegian Air Force. When German pilots appeared over the Vernes airfield, they saw only empty parking areas. A German bomber raid on the Keller Air Base resulted in the destruction of only 2 training aircraft. All others had already departed northward by then. The most dramatic situation developed on the first day of the campaign at Norway's largest airbase, Sola, near Stavanger, from where all operational aircraft were preparing to fly inland: 3 reconnaissance planes, 4 fighter bombers, and 2 attack aircraft. Just as the crews began starting their engines, a formation of 8 German bombers escorted by 2 heavy fighters appeared over the airfield. The first bomb dropped hit a reconnaissance plane, but the others managed to taxi to the runway and, as it turned out, just in time. Only a few minutes after the bombing, transport planes with paratroopers arrived. The preparations for the flight were so rushed that one fighter took off with partially filled fuel tanks, and when the fuel ran out, the pilot had to make a forced landing on an unprepared site, resulting in the destruction of the aircraft. The next day, all operational Army aircraft were concentrated on the ice of Lake Vangsmo, where they were placed on skis. The combined air group was named Group R, commanded by Captain Ola Reistad. Unfortunately, 9 training fighters from the flight school were unable to join this unit. After changing their bases several times and losing another aircraft due to engine failure, its command eventually lost communication and, having no idea what was happening in other parts of the country, decided on April 15th to transfer the remaining operational aircraft to Sweden. While in the south, Norwegian resistance was quickly suppressed, thanks largely to the Germans' absolute air superiority. In the central part of the country, and especially in the north, fighting lasted much longer. On April 14th, one of the fighters sent on reconnaissance discovered 11 German transport aircraft on the ice of Lake Hartwig-Vann, which were transferring mountain troops to the north. After the reconnaissance plane returned, command ordered a bombing attack by 6 attack aircraft, one of which carried not only 110-pound fragmentation bombs, but also a camera. The Norwegian attack was unsuccessful. Bombs dropped from 2,250 feet fell far from the transports, and only a few of them received light damage from fragments. One would expect that after such a visit, the German command would remove the aircraft, but this turned out to be impossible. The transports were practically empty of fuel, and like cattle driven to slaughter, passively awaited their fate. One Norwegian fighter crew, after refueling at Bardufoss, soon reappeared over the improvised German airfield. This time everything went smoothly, an approach along the line and a series of explosions erupted among the 3-engined aircraft. 2 of them immediately burst into flames and 4 were damaged. On April 16th, a Norwegian reconnaissance aircraft confirmed that the surviving transports were still in the same place, and a trio of fighters again bombed them, destroying 3 of the 4 aircraft prepared for takeoff and heavily damaging 5 more. The 4th transport did manage to take off, successfully escaping Norwegian bombs, only to be interned upon landing in Sweden. This was clearly the last success of the Norwegian fighters. On April 22nd, German aerial reconnaissance discovered the base of Group R, and on the same day, bombers raided the ice airfield at Lake Vangemas. Their main target was a twin-engine reconnaissance aircraft, which the Germans still failed to destroy. This raid proved essentially ineffective, but subsequent ones could have been more successful, so it was decided to change base. The aircraft departed in small groups, flying to the new base by different routes. One fighter crew was forced to make an emergency landing due to a malfunction. To assist with repairs, 2 more landed nearby. Just as the work was nearly complete, 3 German dive bombers appeared in the sky. They attacked as if on a training range. 2 fighters were reduced to wreckage, and the third had to be repaired until the next morning, when it finally managed to take off. However, misfortune continued to follow its crew. Heading north, the pilot entered a spin over the mountains. Meanwhile, some of the aircraft that had not yet left the ice airfield at Lake Van Moos were subjected to another raid. This time, a reconnaissance bomber arrived. Its crew dropped 6 110-pound bombs, the explosions of which damaged 2 fighters. Over another lake, the same aircraft's bombardier managed to destroy yet another Norwegian plane. Improved weather conditions allowed German aerial reconnaissance to quickly locate the new Norwegian Air Force base, and after 2 raids on the Setnesmoen airfield conducted on April 30th, the number of fighters was reduced to 7. The technical personnel suffered significant losses. On May 4th, 2 Norwegian aircraft set out to bomb the positions of German mountain troops near a lake at an altitude of 2,159 feet, while another pair attacked targets east of Mount Ligastend. Meanwhile, in the Narvik area, 13 German bombers attacked British ships. Somewhere along the coast, the routes of the Norwegian and German aircraft accidentally crossed, and a rather unusual air battle took place. The battle began on the initiative of the German crew, who directed their bomber across the path of the Norwegian pair. One of the Norwegian aircraft immediately decided to retreat, while the other, with Lieutenants Eggen and Killingmark on board, accepted the fight. For 10 minutes, the opponents poured machine gun fire at each other. While the number of bullet holes on the Norwegian biplane steadily increased, the German aircraft, it seemed, was catching the bullets without any visible damage. Realizing it was time to escape, the Norwegian pilot put his machine into a dive and, leveling out at low altitude, plunged into a narrow valley between the mountains. The Norwegian pilot hoped to break away from the German bomber, but his hopes were not destined to come true. When cliffs rose at the end of the valley directly in front of his aircraft's nose, he was forced to pull the stick toward himself. This was exactly the moment the German aircraft's navigator, flying just above the mountaintops, had been waiting for. A short burst from the nose machine gun pierced through the Norwegian aircraft. The machine still stayed airborne, but this time both crew members were badly wounded, though the pilot managed to bring the plane back to the airfield. Meanwhile, the number of Norwegian air forces, which had no possibility of replenishment, quickly decreased. On May 7th, 1 aircraft of the Northern Group crashed during landing, leaving only 2 Norwegian biplanes and 1 training aircraft in the unit. The next day, all aircraft that were still in flying condition, 5 combat biplanes, the same number of training machines, and 1 captured German aircraft, based in the central part of the country, flew north. While their crews were relocating to the new base, a group of 4 German bombers near a fjord came across a lone Norwegian reconnaissance plane and, after a short fight, turned it into a blazing torch. The end was near, but nevertheless, the crews of the Norwegian biplanes held out until the beginning of June. On the 6th, 1 aircraft bombed German positions at an altitude of 2,044 feet, and 2 days later, on June 8th, the last 2 Norwegian aircraft flew to Finland. For the Dutch, the war began on May 10, 1940. By this time, they still had 28 aircraft of this type in service, with 4 out of the 5 groups of the 2nd Air Regiment. The aircraft were based on 3 airfields. The capture of Holland relied heavily on paratrooper units, for whose landing in key areas of the country about 500 transport aircraft were used. The landings were preceded by powerful air raids, during which the Dutch Air Force lost 42 of their 132 aircraft on the ground. Trying to counter German paratroopers, the Dutch command threw against them all available aircraft in flying condition, including outdated machines whose crews sometimes had to operate without fighter cover, breaking through to the targets past German fighter patrols and dense anti-aircraft fire delivered by the same transports. The main targets for Dutch pilots became their own bridges over canals and the airfields, which turned into real wasp nests. For example, on May 10th, 8 combat aircraft and 3 other machines carried out a suicide raid without fighter escort on the airfields, captured by the paratroopers, where, according to air reconnaissance, about 50 German transports were already stationed. As a result, 5 Dutch aircraft were shot down by anti-aircraft fire and burned near the edge of the airfield. By the night of May 14th, after 4 days of fierce fighting, the Dutch Air Force was completely destroyed. But this was by no means the end of the career of these aircraft. When, in late June 1941, Finland joined Germany in the war against the USSR, its air forces were in urgent need of reinforcements. However, at that moment it was impossible to immediately obtain modern combat aircraft even from Germany. This forced the command to mobilize the already retired old aircraft, including them in a newly formed squadron. It received 4 main aircraft and 4 auxiliary ones. Attached to the 14th Infantry Division operating in Karelia, the squadron mainly carried out tactical reconnaissance, but its crews also delivered bombing strikes when possible. Thanks to the near-total absence of Soviet fighters, the Finnish aircraft operated very actively, spending hours hovering over Soviet positions. However, this could not last forever, and on September 21st, a lone aircraft intercepted by a Soviet fighter crashed to the ground after a short battle in front of Finnish infantrymen. The lesson was learned, and after this incident, Finnish aircraft flew behind enemy lines only under fighter cover. Soon, another aircraft was wrecked while landing due to damage from anti-aircraft fire, and on November 5th, the 2 machines that remained were transferred to the 3rd Detachment of another squadron. From then on, all combat aircraft of this type served exclusively in this unit. By day, the crews mainly carried out reconnaissance and artillery fire correction, the latter also at night. In the dark hours, they also operated as light bombers. After the beginning of 1943, their duties included fighting partisans, though it must be admitted that in Karelia compared to Belarus, there were not too many of them. In total, during the war, 9 such aircraft passed through the 14th Squadron, 7 of which were lost. However, only 1 was due to combat reasons. In June and July 1943, 1 aircraft each was transferred to the 35th Training Squadron and the 6th Squadron, where the crew had to master the calmer profession of target towing. In this role, the aircraft served until November 23, 1944, and the last Finnish aircraft of this type from the training squadron was placed in storage on February 14, 1945.